Ancient Chinese shipbuilders created floating cities that were 450 feet long without using a single blueprint. These wooden giants carried over 1,000 people across oceans nobody had mapped yet. They built ships so advanced that when European explorers finally saw them centuries later, they refused to believe what they were looking at. How did Chinese craftsmen turn raw trees into vessels that wouldn't be matched for 500 years? What exact steps transform bamboo and sticky rice into ocean-conquering monsters? Finding the right wood for a Chinese treasure ship wasn't about chopping down trees. It was about cultivating them like a massive wooden vineyard that took generations to harvest. The Ming Dynasty employed special wood ministers whose only job was managing forests for shipbuilding. These weren't regular foresters. They were tree sommeliers who aged their product for the perfect moment. Each tree got tagged with its planting date, and some families would plant trees knowing their great-grandchildren would cut them down for ships. They literally planted the future Navy. Think about that for a second. You know how your grandma might have planted an apple tree in her backyard? Now imagine she planted it specifically so your kids could build a battleship out of it. That's the level of long-term thinking we're talking about here. The imperial forest system was so complex, it had its own government department with thousands of employees. Trees were organized by species, age, and intended ship part. Some groves were reserved for keels, others for masts, and special sections grew curved branches specifically for ship ribs. Guards patrolled these forests day and night because timber theft was punishable by death. The trees themselves became so valuable that local villages would hold festivals to celebrate when a tree reached shipbuilding age, which could take 80 years. Families would pass down responsibility for specific trees like heirlooms, with sons inheriting their father's duty to protect certain groves. The most prized material was Nanmu wood, which was so valuable that stealing even a small piece meant automatic execution. This golden timber naturally repelled insects and released a cinnamon smell when cut. One large Nanmu trunk could purchase an entire village, and only ships built for the emperor himself could use it. The wood was so perfect that it basically waterproofed itself through natural oils that seeped out over time. It was like having a ship that healed its own wounds. But here's where it gets really wild. Nanmu trees only grew in specific mountain valleys, and the Chinese developed an entire transportation system just to move these logs. They built artificial rivers called timber slides that ran for hundreds of miles down mountainsides. Workers would wait for rainy seasons to release thousands of logs at once, creating wooden tsunamis that thundered down these channels. Entire villages were built along these routes just to guide the logs around corners. Some of these timber highways took 50 years to construct and were considered more valuable than actual roads. You know how Amazon has those massive distribution centers? Well, the Chinese basically invented that concept 700 years ago, except instead of packages, they were moving trees the size of buildings down mountains, using nothing but water and gravity. Camphor trees served double duty in Chinese shipbuilding. Their wood naturally repelled termites while their oil became medicine for the crew. Shipbuilders would burn camphor shavings inside the hull during construction, and the smoke would kill any pests, while leaving behind a protective residue that lasted for years. Walking into a newly built Chinese ship was like stepping into a giant medicine cabinet mixed with a spice market. The smell alone would clear your sinuses and probably add years to your life. While Europeans were still calling bamboo poor man's wood, Chinese builders had already figured out its secret superpower. Bamboo's flexibility made it perfect for shock absorption during storms. They created composite beams with a rigid wood core wrapped in flexible bamboo strips. When massive waves hit the ship, these beams would bend instead of breaking. Modern engineers call this composite material technology, but ancient Chinese shipbuilders just called it common sense. They were basically building ships with built-in suspension systems 5 centuries before anyone invented actual suspension. Wait, it gets better. The actual construction process started with rituals that would seem insane today. Before cutting the first piece of wood, shipbuilders would spend 3 days consulting fortune tellers to find the perfect moment to begin. They believed ships had souls that entered during construction, and starting at the wrong time meant building a cursed vessel. The master shipwright would sleep next to the main keel piece for 7 nights, claiming he could hear the wood telling him how it wanted to be shaped. Whether this was superstition or genius pattern recognition, these masters had success rates that modern builders would envy. The real game changer was how Chinese builders divided their ships into sealed sections like a bamboo stem. While the Titanic would famously sink from a single breach in 1912, Chinese ships from the year 1400 had already solved this problem. Each compartment was completely waterproof, so if you flooded one section, the other 12 would stay bone dry. Think of it like having 13 separate boats pretending to be one ship. If 3 of them sank, the other 10 would keep sailing like nothing happened. This wasn't just clever engineering, it was borderline magic to anyone who saw it. Marco Polo wrote that he watched Chinese sailors deliberately flood compartments to show off to foreign merchants. They'd punch a hole in their own ship, let water rush in, then calmly sail away while European observers nearly had heart attacks. The compartments were so well sealed that some captains would fill different sections with water to adjust the ship's balance, basically using the ocean itself as movable ballast. Can you imagine doing that today? Like deliberately flooding part of your car to show off how well it's built? These guys were the ultimate flex masters of the medieval world. The compartment system went even deeper than just flooding protection. Each section had its own purpose and could be modified independently. Need more storage? Convert a passenger compartment? Carrying delicate cargo? Fill surrounding compartments with sand for stability. Some merchant captains would rent out individual compartments to different traders, essentially running floating shopping malls where each section was a different store. The walls between compartments were so strong that fights in one section wouldn't even be heard in the next one over. Building the hull started differently than anywhere else in the world. While European ships were built skeleton first, Chinese builders started with the shell. They would bend massive planks using controlled fire and weighted stones, shaping the outer skin of the ship before anything else existed. The frame was inserted after, like sliding bones into a body that was already complete. Workers used specialized concave shovels that shaped wood and tested water resistance at the same time. The curve of the shovel matched the ideal hull curve, so the tool itself was the template. Every worker's shovel was slightly different, which created micro variations in the hull that actually improved how water flowed around the ship. The plank bending process was an art form that took decades to master. Workers would bury planks in sand, then build fires on top that burned for exactly calibrated times. Too long, and the wood became brittle. Too short, and it wouldn't bend enough. Master benders could tell the exact moment to remove the heat just by the color of smoke coming off the sand. They'd then use a system of ropes and stones that could weigh up to 500 pounds each, slowly convincing the wood to take the exact curve needed. Some planks would spend weeks being gradually bent into shape, with workers adjusting the weights every few hours, like tuning a giant wooden instrument. Think of it like making the perfect grilled cheese. You know that exact moment when the bread is golden brown but not burnt? These guys could do that with entire trees. The keel wasn't just one beam. It was 7 interlocked pieces that could flex without breaking. Chinese shipbuilders called this the dragon backbone, and it meant their ships could bend with massive waves instead of fighting them. In storms that would snap rigid European ships in half, Chinese vessels would dance with the ocean. The wood pieces were connected using a complex system of joints that locked tighter under pressure. The more stress the ocean put on the ship, the stronger these connections became. It was engineering that got better in bad weather. The joint system deserves its own explanation because it was pure genius. Each connection used a combination of wedges, pins, and sliding dovetails that would shift position as the ship flexed. Imagine a puzzle that rearranges itself to become stronger every time you try to pull it apart. The joints were soaked in tung oil for months before assembly, making them swell to create perfect fits that were somehow both rigid and flexible. Some of these connections were so complex that only master joiners who'd trained for 20 years could create them, and they'd keep their techniques secret even from their own apprentices until the very end of their careers. For the really massive treasure ships, the construction process was insane. The largest ships required 3,000 workers laboring for 3 years straight. Temporary cities sprouted around shipyards, complete with restaurants, temples, and schools for workers' children. Some craftsmen would spend their entire adult lives building a single vessel. Imagine starting work on a ship in your 20s and not seeing it finished until your 40s, and considering that perfectly normal. These weren't just construction sites. They were permanent communities dedicated to creating floating worlds. It's like if the entire town of Green Bay, Wisconsin decided to spend 30 years building one massive Lambeau field that could sail to China. That's the scale we're talking about. Keeping water out wasn't about slapping tar into cracks and hoping for the best. Chinese builders turned their ships into floating chemistry experiments that would make modern scientists jealous. They used tung oil from Chinese wood oil trees that created a finish that actually got harder underwater. This wasn't regular waterproofing, it was reverse waterproofing that used the ocean's own pressure to make itself stronger. The oil was applied in 7 layers, with each layer taking a full week to cure. By the time they finished, the ship had an organic polymer shield that would last decades. But the real secret weapon was something called chunam, which wasn't just caulking, it was basically maritime concrete. The recipe mixed lime, tung oil, bamboo fibers, and here's where it gets weird, sticky rice. Yes, the same rice you'd eat for dinner was keeping 100-ton ships afloat. The glutinous rice created natural polymers that modern chemists still can't fully replicate. This mixture would expand and contract with temperature changes, breathing with the ship instead of cracking. It could seal gaps that opened during storms and would actually get stronger when exposed to salt water. Hold up, did you catch that? They were using leftover takeout rice to build battleships. Your local Chinese restaurant has been sitting on military-grade construction materials this whole time. The application process for chunam was so specific that workers trained for years just to apply it correctly. The mixture had to be pounded into seams with special bronze hammers that were heated to exact temperatures. Too hot, and the mixture would bubble. Too cold, and it wouldn't bond properly. Workers would sing specific songs while hammering to keep the rhythm perfect, because the impact pattern affected how the chunam settled. Some ships had over 10 miles of seams that needed this treatment, requiring tons of sticky rice that cost more than feeding the entire crew for a year. The ships had triple hull systems with 3 layers of planking, each with different grain directions. Each layer was sealed with different compounds, first tung oil, then fish glue, then finally lacquer made from tree sap. Water would need to defeat 3 completely different defense systems to get through, like a wooden fortress with 3 different locks on every door. Some ships even carried tung trees growing in pots so they could make fresh waterproofing oil during voyages. The crew treated the ship like a living patient, with specialists whose only job was healing the vessel's wounds using the same techniques as human medicine. The Chinese junk rig looked nothing like European sails and worked on completely different principles. Forget those square sheets that needed 30 men to operate. Chinese sails had bamboo battens running across them that made them look like spread fans. These battens meant the sails kept their perfect shape even without wind. They pulled the ship forward instead of just pushing it, using aerodynamic principles that wouldn't be formally discovered in Europe for another 400 years. Each sail was divided into segments that could be individually controlled. When a storm approached, the crew could reduce sail area in seconds instead of the 20 minutes it took on European ships. 3 people could operate sails that would normally need 30. The mechanical advantage was so good that one person could control forces that would typically require 10 men. It was like having power steering powered by geometry instead of hydraulics. You know how your car has cruise control? These ships had the medieval equivalent, except it was made of bamboo and operated by pulling ropes in specific sequences. The Chinese had stern-mounted rudders 1,000 years before Europe figured them out. These weren't just big paddles. They were sophisticated control systems that could be raised or lowered for different water depths. The fenestrated rudders had holes cut through them that reduced water pressure while maintaining steering control. Modern racing yachts use the exact same design today because nobody's invented anything better in 600 years. The rudder post itself was a massive tree trunk, sometimes 60 feet tall, that ran through the entire ship. It was so large that it had its own dedicated room with priests who would perform ceremonies to keep the rudder spirit happy. When it came to weapons, these ships weren't messing around. They mounted fire dragons, which were multi-stage rockets launched from bronze tubes. A single ship could fire 30 rockets simultaneously in a barrage that looked like the sky was literally falling. These rockets used multiple propellant stages, technology that wouldn't appear again until NASA started building spacecraft. The psychological effect alone was enough to make most enemies surrender immediately. The ships also carried counterweight catapults built directly into the deck structure. These could launch 100-pound stones or ceramic bombs filled with lime powder that would blind entire enemy crews. The ship's own weight became part of the weapon system, using the vessel's mass to create more launching power. The entire ship was basically a floating siege weapon that happened to also carry people. Picture this: you're a pirate in 1420, feeling pretty good about your little boat with a couple cannons. Then you see a Chinese treasure ship that's literally launching rockets at you while also catapulting boulders and looking like a fire-breathing dragon. What do you even do with that? They had retractable armor panels that could cover gun ports in seconds, transforming from a merchant vessel to a battleship faster than enemy pirates could react. Fire-resistant curtains made from silk, soaked in mud and vinegar, could be deployed to protect against flaming arrows. The crow's nests weren't just for spotting. They were armored sniper positions with mounted crossbows that could rotate 360 degrees. Some ships had dragon heads on the bow that breathed smoke using hidden furnaces inside, making it look like an actual dragon was attacking. The really crazy part was the psychological warfare systems. Ships carried massive drums that could be heard from miles away, creating sound waves that would physically disorient enemy crews. The drums were so large that they required 4 men to operate, and the sound could make people temporarily lose their balance. Paint schemes were designed using optical illusions to make ships appear twice their actual size. Some vessels had fake additional decks painted on their sides that made them look like floating castles. Running a ship with over 1,000 people wasn't just naval operations. It was mobile city management on waves. There were 27 different officer ranks, each wearing specific colored uniforms, so everyone knew exactly who was in charge of what. The hierarchy was so complex that they had officers whose only job was keeping track of other officers. Specialists included astronomer navigators who could find their position using stars, even on cloudy nights, weather predictors who could sense storms 3 days away, and dragon tamers, which is what they called the engineers who maintained the ship's mechanical systems. Ships carried entire farms on board, live animals, vegetable gardens, and even small rice paddies that could grow fresh food during voyages. They had freshwater creation systems using condensation chambers that were basically primitive desalination plants. The waste recycling systems were so efficient that modern environmentalists would be jealous. Everything got reused, from human waste that became fertilizer for the onboard gardens to old sailcloth that became bandages for the medical bay. It was basically a floating Whole Foods, complete with organic farming and composting, except it also had cannons and could sail across the Pacific. Entertainment decks had permanent musicians, acrobats, and storytellers whose job was keeping morale high during voyages that could last years. There were gambling halls with strict regulations, temples for different religions, and markets where crew members could trade personal items. Some sailors would go weeks without seeing daylight, living in specialized sections deep in the ship that were basically floating apartment buildings. The ship's library contained navigation charts worth more than gold, repair manuals that were family secrets passed down through generations, and diplomatic documents that could start or end wars. Some books were literally chained to the ship because they were too valuable to risk losing. The treasure fleets of Admiral Zheng He represented the absolute peak of this technology. His flagship was reportedly 450 feet long, though even Chinese historians argued about whether that was actually possible. What we know for sure is that his fleet included over 300 ships and 27,000 people. These weren't military conquests. They were floating embassies designed to show the world Chinese superiority through sheer overwhelming impressiveness. Think about that number for a second. 27,000 people. That's like the entire population of Key West, Florida, just sailing around the ocean together, showing off how awesome they were. The largest treasure ships had 9 masts and 12 sails, with the main mast being over 300 feet tall. That's taller than the Statue of Liberty. The anchors weighed 8 tons each, and the ship carried 4 of them. The rudder alone needed 40 men to turn it in rough weather. These ships could carry enough supplies to feed 1,000 people for 3 months without resupply. They had pools for keeping fish alive, workshops for making everything from shoes to weapons, and even floating gardens that grew medicinal herbs. The construction techniques were so advanced that when Portuguese sailors first encountered Chinese junks in the 1500s, they literally didn't believe what they were seeing. They reported back to Europe that the Chinese had magical ships that couldn't sink, which European shipbuilders dismissed as sailors' fantasies. It wasn't until European engineers actually examined captured Chinese vessels that they realized these features weren't magic. They were engineering that was centuries ahead of anything in the West. The legacy of these building techniques survived long after the treasure fleets ended. The compartmentalization system that Chinese builders perfected became standard in modern shipbuilding. The idea of using flexible materials that work with ocean forces instead of against them influenced everything from submarine design to offshore oil platforms. The junk rig is still considered one of the most efficient sailing systems ever created, with modern sailors converting their yachts to this ancient design because it simply works better than modern alternatives. These ancient Chinese shipbuilders didn't just create vessels. They engineered floating civilizations that proved humans could turn trees into cities that conquered oceans. Using sticky rice, bamboo wisdom, and mathematical principles we're still rediscovering. They built ships that wouldn't be matched for 500 years. The next time you see a modern cruise ship with its compartmentalized hull and emergency bulkheads, remember that ancient Chinese builders did it first, did it bigger, and did it with sticky rice and pure genius. If you liked this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next one.